General Hospital spoilers reveal that Kai had never seen loyalty as a burden. If anything, it was his anchor. The invisible thread tethering him to a sense of purpose after so many years drifting in pain and disillusionment. And yet, what he felt for Drew wasn't just loyalty in the traditional sense. It was reverence forged in gratitude, a silent vow sealed in the sterile stillness of an operating room. When Drew had stepped in and funded the one surgery that every doctor had deemed too experimental, too dangerous, too costly. But it worked. It healed him. And Kai, for the first time in years, was no longer a broken ex-athlete drowning in regret. He could run again. He could breathe without wincing. And more than anything, he could live. That was Drew's gift to him, freedom from suffering, and it created in Kai a devotion so fierce that it made betrayal feel like sacrilege. So when Kai stumbled upon a conversation he was never meant to hear, when he caught Curtis whispering to Portia about their secret plan to locate Jacinda and convince her, perhaps through payment or manipulation, to rewrite her testimony about the ketamine incident, the ground beneath Kai shifted. The Curtis he thought he knew, the man once guided by principle and integrity, had vanished beneath desperation. Replaced by someone willing to compromise the truth to protect a crumbling marriage and a tainted reputation. The revelation struck Kai with the force of a blow. Not just because it involved deception, but because it threatened the man who had saved him. Curtis didn't want justice. He wanted Jacinda to say that Drew had administered the ketamine to himself, erasing any trace of wrongdoing from Portia's name. And Kai knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that if Jacinda was found and brought back under those conditions, Drew would be destroyed. The man who had lifted Kai from the depths would be dragged back down into them. At first, Kai tried to dismiss it, to reason with himself that maybe he misheard. That maybe it was just idle talk between a husband and wife. But the conviction in Curtis's voice and the silence that followed from Portia, heavy, complicit, undeniable, proved that this was not some theoretical musing. It was a plan in motion. A dangerous, carefully calculated adjustment to the narrative. One that would present Drew not as a victim of betrayal and manipulation, but as an addict who had sabotaged himself. And for Kai, that was a shock so profound it burned straight through any sense of neutrality he had left. He confided in Trina, hoping perhaps that someone connected to Curtis and Portia could provide clarity or intervention. But Trina, already burdened by the unraveling of her parents' marriage, was shaken and urged him to stay out of it. She didn't want to believe her father was capable of such deceit. She didn't want to think her mother could be so ruthlessly self-preserving. But Kai couldn't let it go. His loyalty to Drew didn't allow for silence, not now, not when everything was at stake. So when Drew stopped by General Hospital to check on his recovery, Kai felt the pull of obligation rise like a tide. Drew, always composed, asked how things were going, and Kai responded with the usual reassurances. But there was hesitation in his voice. A flicker of conflict in his eyes that Drew, ever perceptive, picked up on. When pressed, Kai hesitated only a moment longer before telling him everything. The hallway. The voices. The plan. Curtis's intent to reach Jacinda first and rewrite history. Portia's silence. Every word spilled like water breaking through a dam, and when it was over, Drew stood in still, stunned silence. Then, without a trace of anger, he nodded. There was no outburst, no questioning of Kai's motives, only a look of quiet gratitude and steeled determination. Because Kai had done what so few in Port Charles were willing to do, he had chosen truth over comfort, integrity over safety, loyalty over self-preservation. And in doing so, he had ignited the beginning of a new, seismic shift. Drew knew then that this wasn't just about Curtis trying to protect Portia. It was something far more coordinated. Nina had been evasive, and now the pieces began to fall into place. Drew saw clearly that Portia and Nina were working in tandem to bring him down, one for love, the other for leverage. And Curtis, knowingly or not, was becoming the weapon they wielded. It was a fresh shock in a long series of betrayals, but this one felt different because it carried the weight of calculated precision. Drew realized he had little time before Curtis or Felicia, now enlisted as an investigator, found Jacinda and manipulated the narrative beyond repair. She was the only one who could confirm what really happened, the only one who could exonerate him fully or bury him completely. And now, she was being hunted. That knowledge burned inside him. A fire fanned by Kai's courage. Drew had to act, not just to protect himself, but to stop the quiet rewriting of truth. He began tracing every lead he could find, pushing Nina for answers. Using old contacts to uncover possible locations where Jacinda might be hiding. One whisper pointed to the outback of Australia, a remote refuge that matched Jacinda's tendency to disappear when things turned volatile. Drew didn't hesitate. He booked a flight. His every thought a blur of urgency and disbelief. But amid that chaos, one name kept grounding him, Kai. Because in a world where loyalty was fleeting and alliances crumbled under pressure, Kai had chosen to stand firm. Not for attention. Not for advantage. But because he remembered who gave him his second chance. And that choice changed everything. Drew wasn't just chasing a witness. He was racing against a machine built on denial, driven by people who had forgotten what truth looked like. And if he succeeded, it would be in no small part because of Kai's warning, the quiet, seismic shift that set everything in motion. Drew had always possessed a core belief that the truth, no matter how suffocated beneath layers of deception, denial, or manipulation, would eventually claw its way into the light. But even he wasn't prepared for how deeply the betrayal ran or how intimately it was tied to the very people he once thought were allies. What Kai revealed to him was more than just an overheard conversation, it was the unmasking of a conspiracy that had taken root in silence and bloomed in the shadows. Curtis, acting under the guise of loyalty and moral authority, had confided in Portia about a plan to seek out Jacinda and convince her, through manipulation or compensation, to lie, to change her testimony. And ultimately to bury the one truth that could absolve Drew of the stain still clinging to his name. And Portia, whose silence rang louder than any confession, hadn't objected. She hadn't stopped him. She had let the plan unfold like it was inevitable, like Drew's destruction was a fair exchange for her own absolution. And then there was Nina, another calculated participant in this quiet war, who, while pretending to play peacekeeper, had been maneuvering behind the scenes to shield Portia, protect Curtis, and keep Jacinda hidden just long enough for the damage to solidify. This was not simply a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a coordinated strike. A deliberate erasure of truth designed to preserve reputations at the cost of another man's dignity. And it shook Drew to his core, not just because of what it revealed about those around him, but because it made clear that no amount of decency, no amount of patience or quiet endurance, could protect a man from people willing to rewrite reality. But this time, he wouldn't wait to be taken down. He would fight. What Kai had done, his warning, his courage, his refusal to remain silent, had lit a fire within Drew that was no longer fueled by pain, but by purpose. For the first time, Drew saw Jacinda not as a casualty or a distant ally but as a living weapon. A final witness capable of undoing the carefully constructed version of events that Portia and Nina had been crafting. And if Curtis was planning to find her and use her to defend a lie, then Drew would do the unthinkable. He would get there first, not to silence her, but to amplify her. What was unfolding was no longer just a scandal, it was a full-blown crisis. A ticking time bomb of secrets and lies that threatened to detonate at the center of Port Charles and scorch everyone involved. This wasn't just about ketamine anymore. It wasn't just about Drew's past. It was about trust, manipulation, and the terrifying lengths people would go to when their carefully constructed worlds began to crack. Curtis, who once stood for integrity, had become an instrument of cover-up. Portia, who wore her credentials like armor, had allowed that armor to justify her silence. Nina, ever strategic, had exploited every relationship she had to keep the truth fragmented and the danger delayed. But with Kai's revelation, with the raw honesty he had risked so much to deliver, that delay had ended. Now Drew was shifting. He wasn't retreating or protecting anymore, he was preparing to retaliate. And Jacinda was the key. She knew the truth. She had lived it. And Drew understood that if he could protect her from the reach of Curtis and Portia, if he could keep her safe from their desperate campaign to manipulate and rewrite history, then he could dismantle the entire structure of lies they'd spent months constructing. But this wasn't just a race for a witness. It was a war for narrative. And Drew, despite the scars, despite the betrayals, was now ready to win. He had already begun piecing together the locations, using old contacts and legal pressure to extract information from Nina that she had tried to obscure. The moment she hesitated, the moment she shifted her gaze and claimed ignorance, he knew he was close. She was hiding something, perhaps not the whole location, but enough to know that Jacinda hadn't vanished completely. The word outback surfaced like a ghost, whispered from a nurse who once overheard Nina on the phone. And Drew latched onto it like a lifeline. He didn't hesitate. If Curtis and Felicia were moving toward Australia, then so would he. But he wouldn't be arriving with bribes or threats. He would be arriving with the truth. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same Jacinda who had once been painted as unstable, unreliable, someone easily discarded as a liability, was now the one person whose voice had the power to upend everything. And that power, if preserved, could be devastating. Curtis might think he could control the outcome by getting to her first. Portia might believe that silence or money could absolve her. Nina might hope that delay would break Drew's will. But they were all wrong. What Kai had triggered with his warning was not just an act of defense. It was the beginning of a campaign to reclaim control, to expose the manipulation, and to shift the ground under those who thought they had already won. Kai, in his quiet courage, had changed the course of everything. His loyalty wasn't just a personal virtue, it had become the catalyst for a larger reckoning. And now Drew stood in the center of it, no longer a man under siege but a man building a case. Piece by piece, to bring down the wall of lies surrounding him. The crisis was accelerating. The shockwaves were just beginning to ripple through the quiet halls of General Hospital. Through courtrooms, living rooms, and private conversations. Every step Drew took now was calculated, purposeful, and imbued with the knowledge that the people he once trusted had sold him out in the name of convenience. But that betrayal no longer paralyzed him. It propelled him. Jacinda was no longer just a witness. She was the key. And Drew, hardened by truth, fueled by betrayal, and armed with Kai's allegiance, was ready to take back everything. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a reckoning. And it was about to begin. Kai never imagined that telling the truth would cost him Trina. In his heart, everything he had done, every word he had spoken to Drew, every secret he had exposed, had been rooted in a profound and unshakable loyalty. Not just to the man who gave him his second chance, but to the truth itself. He didn't see himself as a hero. He didn't crave recognition. All he knew was that something was deeply wrong, and he had the power to stop it. But in doing so, he crossed a line he hadn't anticipated, the one that separated trust from betrayal in Trina's eyes. She had trusted him not only as a friend but as someone who understood the emotional chaos she had been navigating with her parents. She thought he would protect her from more pain, not be the one to unleash it. When Kai told her what Curtis planned to do, how he was going to find Jacinda and convince her to lie about Drew and the ketamine scandal, Trina didn't react with gratitude. She reacted with disbelief. With anguish. Because hearing the truth from Kai made it real. Made it irreversible. And it broke something fragile between them. This wasn't just a personal fallout. It was one of the most devastating emotional detonations Port Charles had seen in recent memory, and it was only the beginning. Kai's decision to reveal what he knew didn't just shift the course of one man's life, it triggered a collapse. A rupture in the system of quiet deception and calculated secrecy that people like Curtis and Portia had carefully constructed to protect themselves. And the most jarring part of it all was how quickly things spiraled once that single domino fell. One of the newest and most unpredictable shocks to hit the hospital wasn't the revelation of who did what or who lied to whom. It was how fast control was lost. How one young man's conscience could dismantle the scaffolding of an entire cover-up. Curtis had believed he was doing the right thing for his family. He had convinced himself that finding Jacinda and steering her testimony wasn't about deceit, it was about preserving what he had left. His marriage. His integrity. But the moment Kai exposed the plan, everything Curtis was trying to protect began to crumble. Portia, once insulated by Curtis's protection, suddenly found herself in the eye of the storm. No longer just a complicit observer. She became a central figure in a scandal that was expanding by the hour. And Nina, who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to delay exposure, manipulate alliances, and control access to Jacinda, was no longer operating in the shadows. Her involvement was now a matter of whispered conversations in hospital corridors, suspicious glances, and growing isolation. What was once a carefully coordinated effort had now become a frenzied scramble for damage control. But the damage was already done. One of the most significant recalibrations now occurring in Port Charles was the collective realization that the old rules no longer applied. Secrets couldn't be contained. Lies couldn't be maintained. And loyalty, true, unyielding loyalty like the kind Kai had shown Drew, was no longer an abstract virtue. It was a weapon. A catalyst. A force strong enough to destabilize everything. Trina's heartbreak over Kai's actions wasn't rooted in hatred. It was rooted in loss. She didn't see him as a villain. She saw him as a mirror, someone who had chosen a path she wasn't brave enough to walk yet. His truth made her pain undeniable. It forced her to confront the possibility that her father, the man she defended time and time again, was no longer the man she thought he was. It made her question everything, her family, her values, and her own silence. And that, more than anything, was why she couldn't forgive him. Not yet. But Kai hadn't done this for forgiveness. He had done it because silence, in this case, was complicity. And with Jacinda now in the crosshairs of multiple agendas, he knew that the truth couldn't afford to wait any longer. What Drew was preparing to do, what he was building, was more than a defense. It was a reckoning. He wasn't going to let Curtis and Portia get to Jacinda first. He was going to find her, protect her, and use her testimony not as a shield, but as a sword. The very thing they had tried to suppress was now the very thing Drew would use to expose them. The crisis was deepening by the hour. The emotional and political landscape of Port Charles was shifting rapidly. Every hallway conversation, every sidelong glance, every hushed phone call felt loaded with tension. People were beginning to take sides. Some backed Curtis, convinced his motives were noble. Others rallied around Drew, seeing him not as a man trying to clear his name, but as a symbol of how far the corruption had spread. And in the middle of it all was Kai, silent, steady, carrying the weight of a decision that had cost him so much and yet still felt undeniably right. One of the most shocking consequences of all was how irreversible everything now seemed. There was no going back to what had been. The adjustment underway was seismic. Relationships were ending. Trust was unraveling. Reputations were eroding in real time. And the ripple effect was expanding outward, touching people who hadn't even realized they were part of this narrative. Felicia, sent to find Jacinda on Curtis's behalf, was starting to ask questions of her own. Maxie had begun quietly probing around the hospital, trying to piece together what was happening. Even Ava, drawn into the periphery of Nina's world, began to sense that something massive was unfolding, and that Nina's hands were far from clean. And still, the center of the storm held fast to one undeniable truth: Kai had told the truth. And in doing so, he had shattered the illusion that silence is safety. He had proven that truth, no matter how painful, no matter how isolating, demands to be spoken. The fallout may have been devastating. The betrayal, at least in Trina's eyes, may never be repaired. But in exposing the plan, in stopping Curtis and Portia from rewriting history, Kai had done something no one else had the courage to do. He had drawn a line. And now, the city would have to decide which side it was on. Everything was going further than anyone had imagined. The scandal had metastasized into a full-blown war of conscience. The shock was no longer about who did what. It was about who still had the strength to face what came next. Portia was unraveling. Curtis was cracking. Nina was running out of places to hide. And Drew, fueled by betrayal, armed with clarity, and guided by Kai's truth, was no longer playing defense. The madness had only just begun. Drew had never asked for a war, but now that one had been declared against him, he was no longer willing to be the casualty. He had spent months silently enduring the ripple effects of betrayal, confusion, and public suspicion, carrying the burden of a scandal that had not only stained his reputation but threatened to destroy everything he had rebuilt in his life. He had trusted too deeply. He had given the benefit of the doubt too generously. And for all that faith and restraint, he had been rewarded with manipulation, deceit, and a vicious attempt to rewrite his story. But now, as the layers of lies peeled away and the ugly truth began to expose itself, Drew wasn't retreating into silence. He was preparing for retaliation. And it wouldn't be impulsive or emotional. It would be precise, devastating, and unstoppable. The moment Kai came forward and told Drew what he had heard, that Curtis had confided in Portia about a plan to track down Jacinda and persuade her to change her account of the ketamine scandal, it was as if a switch had flipped in Drew. It confirmed every quiet suspicion, every gut feeling he'd buried under doubt. Curtis, the man who once stood for law and principle, had become a pawn in a scheme to protect his wife at any cost. Portia, who had always preached medical ethics and integrity, had allowed silence and complicity to replace truth. And Nina, whom Drew had once viewed as flawed but trustworthy, was right at the heart of the conspiracy, using her influence and access to keep Jacinda hidden. To delay exposure long enough for them to regain control. It was a network of deception. Built carefully and deliberately by people who wanted to erase Drew's truth and replace it with a narrative more convenient for themselves. But now Drew had something they hadn't accounted for, certainty. And certainty was a dangerous thing when it belonged to a man who had nothing left to lose. What had once been a scandal involving medical records and conflicting testimonies was now becoming a full-scale collapse of trust, morality, and professional integrity. The adjustment Curtis and Portia had tried to orchestrate, the manipulation of Jacinda's truth, wasn't just an act of desperation, it was a ticking time bomb. And Drew now intended to make sure it exploded in their hands, not his. The entire crisis had begun spiraling into a new realm of intensity. This wasn't about legal battles anymore. It wasn't about who said what on record. It was about the emotional implosion happening behind the scenes, about the quiet breakdowns behind closed doors. About the disintegrating relationships and reputations that no longer had anywhere to hide. Drew's counterattack was already in motion, and it wasn't loud or theatrical, it was methodical. He had already arranged transportation to Australia, where Jacinda had fled. While Curtis had foolishly believed he could contain the narrative by getting to her first and bribing or pressuring her into submission, Drew was planning something far more devastating. To bring her back on his terms, under his protection, and allow her to speak freely, unafraid, untainted, and unfiltered. Jacinda wasn't just a witness. She was the embodiment of the truth that had been silenced. And in Drew's hands, she would be the match that set fire to every lie carefully constructed around him. Portia's medical career, built on credibility and trust, was now balanced on a knife's edge. Curtis's already fragile marriage was imploding under the weight of a plan that had backfired before it even began. And Nina, for all her manipulation and resourcefulness, was finally facing the consequences of playing puppet master in a war she thought she could control. What made the situation even more chilling was the psychological shift that had begun to grip Port Charles. The people who had once stood confidently in their respective roles, Curtis as a leader, Portia as a healer, Nina as a strategist, were now crumbling under the invisible pressure of Drew's restraint. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. His silence had become its own form of oppression, his every movement now carrying the weight of inevitability. They knew he was coming. They knew he had the truth. And the fear of what he might do with it was more powerful than any public accusation. It was one of the most terrifying transformations Port Charles had ever witnessed, not because of violence, but because of the slow, relentless dismantling of power. Drew had become the hand of accountability, moving through each moment with a clarity none of them had. He wasn't just preparing for justice, he was preparing for dismantlement. Curtis and Portia weren't just scrambling to preserve their lives, they were now watching them unravel in real time. The emotional toll had already begun to show. Curtis had become erratic, visibly stressed, lashing out at those around him. Portia was losing grip. Her once firm demeanor cracking with each question she couldn't answer, each lie she couldn't maintain. The entire town was beginning to notice. Conversations changed. People grew colder. Hospital staff whispered in corners. Friends became distant. Curtis and Portia found themselves increasingly isolated, surrounded not by support but by suspicion. And all of it, every downward spiral, every unraveling thread, was traceable back to one quiet moment when Kai chose to tell the truth. That decision, made from a place of integrity, had become the catalyst for the greatest realignment Port Charles had seen in years. But the most horrifying part had yet to come. Because Drew, now empowered by clarity and evidence, was not finished. His next step wasn't to gloat or punish. It was to expose. In one carefully orchestrated press conference, or maybe a legal deposition, or perhaps even a dramatic courtroom showdown, Drew would present Jacinda, not as a pawn, but as the final arbiter of truth. Her words would be damning. Her testimony would be a weapon. And everything Curtis and Portia had tried to adjust, manipulate, and bury would come screaming to the surface, raw and undeniable. The fallout would be catastrophic. Portia's medical license would hang in the balance. Curtis's influence in law enforcement and community circles would evaporate. Nina's empire, already teetering on scandal after scandal, would finally collapse under the weight of cumulative exposure. And Drew, once the victim, once the quiet man in the corner, would stand at the center of it all, not as a symbol of revenge, but as the product of what happens when good people are pushed too far for too long. This was no longer a scandal. It was a disaster. A full-blown moral catastrophe that had grown out of arrogance, fear, and the belief that truth could be contained. It couldn't. Not anymore. Drew had made sure of that. The adjustment was over. The reckoning had begun. And there would be no survivors among those who had chosen lies over loyalty, deception over decency. Because the storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived, and Drew was its eye.